Well, there was a tourist that went to San Francisco. He'd never been there before, but he heard a lot about it, and he wanted to visit some of the touristy places. And so he was at one curio shop, and he was looking around at this, and he noticed that there was this very odd thing. It was a statue of a rat that was made out of bronze, and it was about a foot high, sitting on its hind quarters. And it just caught his attention, and he looked for a price. There was no price tag on it. So he went up to the manager there, and he said, how much are you selling this bronze rat for? And the manager said, well, you can have it for $20, and I'll tell you the story of it for $200. The man said, I'll give you $20, and you can keep the story. And so he went out with his bronze rat, and he was walking near Fisherman's Wharf with his rat. And he noticed that as he passed by one of the alleyways, there were a couple of rats that were peeking out from behind a couple of garbage cans. And he thought it was kind of odd, and he just kept walking. And then he heard this little squeaking behind him, and there were about half a dozen rats who were following him down the sidewalk. And he became a little bit concerned about this, and so he walked a little bit faster, and he noticed some more rats coming out from behind trash cans until he had about a dozen behind him. And he started walking a little bit faster. He knew where Fisherman's Wharf was, and he was thinking, I just need to get there pretty quick and get rid of whatever this rat statue. And so he was now into a trot. And when he looked back again, there were about 100 following him, and they were scampering over each other, trying to get in front up to the beginning of this. And then he took off on a full sprint for the wharf. And he got there. When he turned around, there were about 1,000 behind him. And he took that bronze statue, and he hurled it as high and as far as he could up over into San Francisco Bay. And then amazingly, all of the rats followed that rat right off into the bay, and within the next 2 minutes, they all drowned. He thought about this, and he was just astounded. He turned around and made his way back to the shop where he had bought the rat. And when he walked in, the manager said, I knew it! You came back for the story. And the man said, no, I didn't. I came back to see if you had any more bronze statues, particularly of politicians. Now that story, believe it or not, relates to the book of Micah, as we will look at today. The history of Micah is a prophet that spanned over the course of 3 different kings of Judah. And some of his prophecy was related to the northern kingdom, which is the beginning of the book. Most of it is related to the southern kingdom of Judah. You'll hear the word Samaria, which is the capital of the northern kingdom, and Jerusalem, the capital of the southern kingdom. And it's basically divided generally into 3 different topics. There's sort of what's wrong with man, and then what is the remedy for that, and then what does God do about this? Sort of breaks down into this. Now, the thing that Micah talks about here is a word that the Old Testament calls corruption. Human corruption. Now, when we generally today think about corruption, what we think about are crooked politicians who take bribes, that they're corrupting their office for their own benefit. And that certainly is one application of this. But what Micah is going to show us is that corruption is not just limited to politicians, but it's also related to judges, where judges and the kinds of decisions that they make that are unjust, or to people in business. It can relate to that. It can also relate to people like me in the ministry. And it relates really, when he finally gets down to it, to every one of us. There's something that is corrupt inside of us. Well, what does that corruption mean? You can think of corruption this way. It looks like this should work, and yet when I go to try to make it work, it doesn't quite work the way it's supposed to. It just doesn't quite do what I thought. I usually have to call a repairman if I am trying to put something together, no matter how simple it may seem. There is some type of corruption inside of the user, or in the institution, the people that run the institution, or all the way down to our personal lives. Now, what's going on historically is this. From the time of King David, that was the height of Israel, and then King Solomon took over after his father's death. And then during King Solomon's reign, the nation started to go into a moral and spiritual decline. And it affected all the institutions of life. It affected the government institution, politicians, judgeships, business, the priests, and even some of the false prophets, all the way down to what we would call today broken families. And I don't mean just divorced families, but families who are still intact, but there's just dysfunction inside the house. Corruption has gone all the way down to inside my own home, the idea. And what is described for about 200 years is this process of just slowly swirling downward, almost imperceptible to the average person over the course of about 200 years. And Micah is a prophet that's coming. His ministry is about 40 years. It covers the tail end of the northern kingdom before its demise, and then picks up again in the southern kingdom. He starts off the book rather strongly, and he's talking about judgment. And he's talking particularly to the northern kingdom, where judgment is long overdue. The whole civilization, the society, has become so corrupted. In one sense, as we'll see in a few minutes, not unlike our own today. Here's what he starts. Look, the Lord is coming from his dwelling place. And the idea is he wants them to raise their eyes, and he has imagery that he's going to portray to the people. He comes down and treads on the heights of the earth. And so you have this picture that Micah is seeing of a great God, something like Jack and the Beanstalk, the great giant is a picture that he's trying to describe here. And treads on the heights of the earth. The mountains melt beneath him, and the valleys split apart like wax before the fire, like water rushing down a slope. Now, this imagery that he's using is not physical. That's not the application. What he's describing here is a kind of judgment that is just overwhelming. It's just going to rock our world. Things are going to be different when this is done, when he cleans house. Verse 6, I will make Samaria a heap of rubble, a place for planting vineyards. I will pour her stones into the valley and lay bare her foundations. Now he's becoming more descriptive. The stone walls around that covered the protection for the main cities are going to be destroyed. The buildings made of rock and stone are going to be leveled. The farmland is going to become useless as the Assyrians throw rocks and stones into the farmland. The devastation is complete. All her idols will be broken to pieces. All her temple gifts will be burned with fire. I will destroy all her images, since she gathered her gifts from the wages of prostitutes. As the wages of prostitutes, they will be used again. Now, this happens to the northern kingdom about roughly 10 years after he prophesies this. And the way it happens historically is that Assyria, which was the dominant power at the time, invades the northern kingdom. The people never did repent. They completely blew off all the prophets and all the warnings. They continued on in their stubborn ways. And Assyria came in and devastated the army, devastated the land, the vegetation, took all the herds and flocks away, and took most of the people away in chains and slavery. Utter and complete devastation. Now, what he uses is this prophecy for the rest of the book to the southern kingdom, and says, pay attention. You have a visual aid here. You have to turn to God. You cannot continue on the way that you are. And then he goes into some examples of corruption. Chapter 2, verse 1, woe to those who plan iniquity, to those who plot evil on their beds. At morning's light they carry it out, because it is in their power to do it. They covet fields and seize them, and houses and take them. They defraud people of their homes. They rob them of their inheritance. Now, these are just a few examples of the corruption of both government and business. From government point of view, the Old Testament, the law of Moses, was very clear about land. It wanted to make sure that all of the land in each of the 12 tribes stayed in those 12 tribes. And each of the land that was allocated to each clan stayed within that clan. And each parcel of land that was dedicated to each family stayed in that family. Now, calamity happens and people go in debt and things happen and they have to sell their land, but there was a means by where periodically a family or a clan could buy back their land so it could stay within their clan or their family or their tribe, one of the 12 tribes of Israel. But by this time, the government leaders and business leaders said, that's not a good idea. In other words, these folks were not unlike our own politicians, who it looks like they're ruling for us. We're for the little people. We're for the middle class. And then the laws that they pass really benefit them mostly. That's corruption. It looks like it should work, but it doesn't. Judges were the same way. They took bribes, just like, not unlike our day, to where sometimes the guilty go free. If you have enough money in our country, and if you're powerful enough in our country, you can get away with almost anything if you have enough money. And there are people that come to my mind which I will not mention. Same was true back then. Verse 6, he speaks to the prophets and priests. Do not prophesy, their prophets say, meaning to him. They're speaking to Micah. Do not prophesy about these things. Disgrace will not overtake us. You descendants of Jacob, should it be said, does the Lord become impatient? Does he do such things? So Micah and some of his folks were getting flack from some of the other priests and some of the prophets, who basically were in the business of telling people what they want to hear to ingratiate themselves for their own benefit in keeping their job as prophet or priest. Does this sound familiar? This is corruption. It looks like the prophet is doing what he's supposed to do, but ultimately there's something else going on, ingratiating himself for his own favor. Now, to all these institutions and the people in them, government, justices, business people, and prophets. In chapter 3, verse 4, Micah says, then they will cry out to the Lord, but he will not answer them. At that time, he will hide his face from them because of the evil they have done. At this point, God says, if you're going to insist on living with corruption, go ahead. Good luck with that. Let's see what happens. Let's see how that plays out. And then the last part of this, which really rings true to me, is the last part of this downward spiral of a culture over 200 years now comes down to everybody's home and everybody's personal relationships. In chapter 7, verse 5, Micah says, do not trust a neighbor. Does this sound familiar? Does this ring a little bit true? Put no confidence in a friend. Even with the woman who lies in your embrace, guard the words of your lips. A culture has become so corrupt that you can't even trust the people that you most think you could trust. This is rock bottom in the decline of a civilization. For a son dishonors his father. A daughter rises up against her mother. A daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies are the members of his own household. Does it sound like today? Think about the news that you and I have heard over the last year. We have become a sue-happy nation. People, when something goes wrong, they can't wait to hire an attorney and go to court to get something out of this for them. Think about how many of us are afraid to get involved in the lives of other people. Some because of suing or health reasons. When I was growing up, there was never a question about getting involved in situations like this. Not so much anymore. In fact, you might have read the story in a New York subway last week of a woman who was sexually assaulted for about 45 minutes in a subway train, and not one person stopped to help her. Instead, what they did was they took out their phones. And not a single person called 911. That went on for 45 minutes and resulted in attempted rape. This is the bottom of a culture. in our own lovely state. You can go to any store you want to and steal up to $950 with no threat of prosecution, as long as you don't go over that limit. $950 per day. Think about cancel culture, with which we are very familiar. And cancel culture goes all the way down, just like Micah says in chapter 7, all the way down into our homes, where he's very descriptive here. And the thing I think about the most, that I just think about this often, is I remember the days when I used to enjoy common courtesy. It seemed like that was everywhere I went. Men always opened their doors for their wives or their daughters. You always open doors when you're going through. You always look behind to see if somebody was coming behind you, man or woman. If you were going to get a refill of something, you always asked if somebody else needed something, or do you need some water, or is there something I can get for you? That was just a way of life. And we called it common courtesy. Well, somewhere about 15 years ago, I quit calling it common courtesy, and I switched to uncommon courtesy. And then a few years ago, I switched to rare courtesy. And there are times where I am fighting to do that myself against the tide that we live in. This is the culture Micah's talking to. And it's not that different from our culture. Now, that's the problem. And there's something wrong in human nature that affects every one of us in multitudes of ways. Well, what's the remedy? The practice that's needed is just dealings. Just dealings. Dealing justly with the people around us. Now, in Micah Chapter 6, this is so interesting to me because in some of the book, Micah makes his appeal, God makes his appeal in a didactic way. He points out what's wrong and what needs to be changed. But in chapter 6, the appeal is very personal. As you'll see in Micah 6, verse 3. And God asks the people through Micah the prophet, "My people, what have I done to you? How have I burdened you? Answer me. I brought you up out of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery." The idea is, do you not remember where you've come from? I sent Moses to lead you, also Aaron and Miriam. Remember your journey. And he mentions Balaam's donkey and how he saved Israel from being cursed as another illustration here. Remember your journey that you may know the righteous acts of the Lord. You may think that what you're doing is no big deal. But isn't there something in you that appeals to something in me? Isn't there some loyalty? Some faithfulness that arises in your heart as you think, how can you do this in light of what I have done? Well, the people, at least momentarily, seem responsive. And this is their reply, Micah 6:6. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? And some of these are thinking about the Old Testament law. Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of olive oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? Apparently, the conviction of sin finally broke through with some of these people. And they said, what can we do? What should we do? And then the most famous verse in the book of Micah is God's response, Micah 6:8. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. What does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Set your eyes there, and not just some religious response. Well, the part that I'd really like to focus on is the part that there are many promises in this book that God makes, that in spite of how bad it is, the book does not end on a downer. It ends with hope for people who will respond, who will see God the Redeemer. The promise of God to mankind is forgiveness. And here is one of those, it almost seems rather strange that it's included here. O little town of Bethlehem, as we think of it, Micah 5:2. But remember that Micah's ministry covered about 40 years. We only have 7 very short chapters of that. Try to imagine just taking 7 messages of mine over the last 35 years and to try to get a summary. So what Micah is including in the book here is some of the best, which includes Micah 5, which is going to reference the day, what we call Christmas, the time of Christmas. So we'll jump to Matthew chapter 2, verse 2. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi, we call them the wise men, from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." Now, King Herod is bothered by this because they said, "Where is the King of the Jews?" And Herod, well, that's me. What do you mean, King of the Jews? I'm it. And yet they were referencing someone else. He was disturbed, verse 3, and all Jerusalem with him. When he called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked where the Messiah was to be born. And the answer was easy for the Old Testament scholars. They knew this just like this. Everybody knew exactly the answer to that question. And they quoted Micah, verse 6. "But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." So the answer comes to King Herod, and the kings hear this too, and they take off for Bethlehem. Verse 8, he sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I may go and worship him." Another picture of corruption. I'm going to look noble while at the same time do what's best for me. After they heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Now, what's clear in this story is that all the religious leaders knew exactly what was going to happen and where, and the identity of the baby that was going to be born. No doubt about it. Now, what they quote is Micah, and it's a prophecy that is at least 700 years old prior to this event. Imagine thinking about the year 2721 and making a specific prophecy about a little town in an obscure land that's very detailed. And then if you could fast forward, it's just like he said, down to the detail. Micah 5:2, "You Bethlehem, Ephratah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come from the one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old and from ancient times." Now, this is not just a baby or any baby or even a special baby or a special person or a special rabbi. The identity of this child is also hinted at twice in this verse, at the end of the verse, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times. And the second word there in the Hebrew is Yam Alam. At first I thought it was Home Alone. But that's not what it is. Yam Alam. The day eternal. From eternity. He's describing not just somebody who's going to be born, and that's their first moment of life, but someone who has been alive always and is going to come here. Verse 4, "He will stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, and the majesty of the name of the Lord is God, and they will live securely, for then his greatness will reach to the ends of the earth." He wrote that 700 years before Christ. Christianity has been going on now for a little over 2,000 years. And guess what's happened? The last part of that prophecy is being fulfilled. His greatness will reach to the ends of the earth. Well, chapter 7 is really one of those cool chapters, and I wish I had a whole time to do this, but we don't. And so we're going to dive in. There's really two sections of this. And what I would like for you to do is use your imagination and pretend that you're in a courtroom. And all of you are in the gallery watching. And up there is the judge and the bench. And the witness stand is over here. And over here is the defense table. And over here is the prosecution. And Micah is going to play the role of the people. As he outlines this in chapter 7. And so he is brought in by the bailiff, and he sits down at the defense table. And as he looks up, as he looks across at the prosecutor, what he sees is God is sitting at the prosecution table. And I can imagine Micah going, and the prosecutor stands up to make his case. And he calls his first witness. And his first witness is also God. And so God gets up, he's sworn in, he takes his place up at the witness stand, and the prosecutor begins to talk to the witness. And as Micah's sitting there at the defense table, he's just withering because he knows it's all true. All of these things that are being said in Micah 7, 1 through 6, every one of them true of the people. And you can just see him deflating. We come down to verse 7. But something happens in Micah. Verse 7, but as for me, I watch and hope for the Lord. I wait for God, my Savior. My God will hear me. Every other possibility of hope has vanished in that courtroom, except one. And the one he still says, no matter how miserable this looks, and no matter how much trouble I am in, and no matter how much wrath and punishment I deserve, my hope is still in God. He says, verse 7. Verse 8, this hope starts to blossom. It gains sort of a life of its own. Verse 8, do not gloat over me, O my enemy. Though I have fallen, I will rise. Though I sit in darkness, the Lord will be a light to me. No matter what happens here, he knows that God is still a God of hope and will walk him through whatever the verdict is. Verse 9. He says, because I have sinned against him, I will bear the Lord's wrath. In other words, he hears what the witnesses have said. He hears what the prosecution has said. He knows that up behind on the bench, God is sitting as the judge. His case is hopeless, we would say. Because I have sinned against him, I will bear the indignation of the Lord's wrath. And then the next word is the hinge word in this section. Until. And things begin to change. Until he pleads my case and upholds my cause. Now, what happens in the courtroom? Well, the prosecutor, who has been God, sits down at the table, and as Micah is over here thinking, what am I going to do? He looks to his left, and he looks, and he has a new defense attorney. And the defense attorney is God himself. And God himself gets up from the defense attorney, and as Micah says, he begins to plead my case. The defense attorney, and upholds my cause. That'd be a tough case to try to defend. Then he says, he will bring me out into the light. And the he switches from the defense attorney to the judge. And the judge is apparently swayed by the defense attorney. And when the verdict comes in, he says, not guilty. And the judge gets up and walks down to Micah and says, you're free to go. And he walks him out of the courtroom, out for the press conference, as we do in our day and age. And this is Micah's conclusion. He says, I will see his righteousness. Now, you'd expect him to say, I will see his mercy. And he certainly did see God's mercy. But he also saw something really important that had been missing, and that was God's righteousness. The people knew about God's mercy, and they played upon it wrongly. What they learned was his righteousness. And then you see the stunning reversal of the whole court scene. Verse 10. Then my enemy will see, maybe some of the people in the gallery that were cheering for the verdict of guilt, will see it and be covered with shame, who said to me, where is the Lord your God? My eyes will see her downfall. Even now she will be trampled underfoot like the mire of the streets. In other words, the people who were crucifying Micah for his guilt and coming down on him, the great reversal of sin is now going to come upon them. And Micah is going to find himself a free man out in the street. One other picture of hope here is the very end of the book. Micah 7:15. As in the days when you came out of Egypt, God says, I will show them my wonders. Nations will see and be ashamed. Deprived of all their power, they will put their hands over their mouths and ears will become deaf. Now, what God is describing through the prophet Micah is that no matter how awful the world lives now, we still live under the rule and the law of sowing and reaping. And all of the reaping hasn't yet been done. And so for those people who think they're getting away with whatever it is at a government level, business level, financial level, religious level, or family or personal level, it's just a matter of time. You cannot escape the law of sowing and reaping. We reap what we sow. And that's what God says to Micah here. There's coming a day when the most arrogant of nations, all the way down to the most arrogant of people who thought they got away with it, they're going to have their mouths shut and their eyes opened. And they're going, and the idea is, what in the world did I do? What was I thinking? How could I have been so blind and so stubborn? And then he ends these last few verses with a play on Micah's own words. The word Micah in the Hebrew means, who is a God like this? Which is how he starts verse 18. Who is a God like you, who pardons sin, forgives the transgressions of the remnant of his inheritance? You do not stay angry forever, but delight to show mercy. What other God is there that does this? He asks. And it's a rhetorical question. It doesn't matter what religion and what God is claimed in there. There is no other God that forgives sin and cleanses us. We are always left with the residue of our sin. No matter how religious or what religion we think we're following, that's right. You will again have compassion on us. What God is like this? You will tread our sins underfoot and hurl all our iniquities into the depths of the sea. And here the image, the Jewish people have this really great thing called tashlich. On the first day of Rosh Hashanah, their Jewish New Year, they take bread and they go to the sea or the ocean or a moving stream or river. And they do in symbolic form what Micah just said here. They take their bread and they throw it into the water as a symbol of what Micah has described here. God has described through Micah. And what happens to the bread? Well, you can sort of use your imagination here. Some of the hungry fish are pretty excited about that bread. And they gobble up that bread without taking any sin within themselves. And some of that bread maybe dissolves before it gets to the bottom of the sea. And maybe some, the lobsters, the bottom feeders, eat the bread, maybe. But to the people on shore, it's gone. It's gone. It's out of sight. You will be faithful and show love to Abraham as you pledged on oath to our ancestors in days long ago. Jeremiah says, I will forgive their wickedness and remember their sin no more. Again, it's a picture of the sin being taken out of our sight. Now, this symbolic tashlich thing and throwing bread into the water, that's a great symbol. It's a great symbol. But it doesn't deal with all of what we deal with sin. That doesn't deal with our guilt of sin. The cross does. It doesn't deal with the shame of sin. The cross does. It doesn't deal with the weight of sin that we feel. The cross does. It doesn't deal with the debt of sin. The cross does. And speaking of debt, we have politicians that love to put out there every election season that they're for canceling student debt. Now, as a parent who's already paid some amount of student debt, I think of that and think, if you thought this was a good idea, for some of us, it would have helped if you'd come up with this a long time ago. But they act as if you can just pass a law, take your magic wand, and suddenly the student debt is gone. Well, it's gone for the student. But it's not gone for the banks who have the loans. And it's not gone from the government entities that have made these loans. The debt is still there. We've just passed the debt payment to someone else. And guess who that would be? You and me will pay the debt for student debt. But that's not how the cross works. He's not coming back to any of us for the debt we owe. Why? Because the debt deals with our payment of sin. Our payment of sin. 3 years ago, in next month, I have in my hand one of my favorite pieces of paper in our garage. It's a note from Chase Bank. And it declares that our mortgage was paid off in full. Our debt was paid. Debt's gone, and it was paid. Well, we paid it. And you know what? I haven't heard from Chase Bank in 3 years. I don't anticipate I will. I have no need to hear from Chase Bank anymore. This is what the cross does for us. He takes our sin, every one of them and every factor related to them, upon himself. Let's pray together. Father, there's some amazing pictures in this book of Micah. The whole Christmas prophecy, down to the details, in an obscure little village halfway around the world with two people that nobody paid any attention to. At least 700 years prior. The diagnosis of our corruption, the human problem that infects every one of us. It looks like we should be doing what is right and what we should be doing and in our relationships with people, but something in us gets in the way and makes a mess. Whether it's at an institutional level, in our home, or in ourselves. He has shown you, O man, what is good. What does the Lord require of you? But to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. And that is made possible, and only possible, by the cross of Jesus Christ, who takes our corruption upon himself and pays our debt, pays for our sin, wears the clothes of our sin, our guilt, our shame, and the weight of sin upon himself. Father, that is why we are here again this morning, to remind ourselves of this, as we sang about so well this morning, and to hear Micah remind us of these things again. As we take communion in just a moment, help us to focus on the cross, the sacrificial death of your Son, who voluntarily, out of love, laid down his life for us and shed his blood that we might be your people and enjoy that relationship now and forever.